to listen to me. You came to listen to Ambassador Mirpuri, who has served the Singapore government for many, many years and is going to talk about the Southeast Asia region, which is of interest, of course, to all of us. And we all know how successful it has been. So with that, let me step down and introduce Ambassador Mirpuri.
I like brief introductions. They're very practical. And let me just put this down for a moment. I know you've had a very intense morning discussing the global economy, the transatlantic picture, and you've put me in between the day just before your main course. So I think that sets a certain framework for how much I can tell you and what I want to tell you. But I wanted to speak a little bit, a perspective of developments from Singapore, from Southeast Asia, and in particular, the role and engagement of the United States with the Asia Pacific, which is very much a centerpiece of the current administration's foreign policy priorities. Now, it's widely acknowledged that the Asia Pacific is going to be the next frontier for global economic growth. Many of your firms are already in the Asia Pacific, and you may have already traveled there yourself. Those of you with any experience in the Asia Pacific probably already sense the dynamism in the region as the various countries are coming together in bilateral and regional economic arrangements and partnerships. For those of you who have not yet traveled out to Southeast Asia, I would suggest that you start planning your trip. And there's no better place to start than in Singapore. It's too late this year, but this weekend in Singapore is the annual Formula One race. You may be a NASCAR fan, but I suggest that if you're awake on Sunday morning at 8 a.m., that you turn on the sports channel and watch the F1 in Singapore live. It will be 8 p.m. in Singapore, 12 hours time difference. And the Singapore race is the only night race in the F1 series. And uniquely for the F1, just like Monaco, the race takes place in the city. We shut the city down for a week for the race to take place. So it's a glittering spectacle on TV, and of course, much better if you can make it out there in September 2014 for next year's race. I mentioned the F1 not just as a tourist sort of connection for you, but really because for Singapore it represents more than just a race. It brings together in many ways the very dramatic transformation of Singapore over the past 50 years. When Singapore became independent in 1965, we were a poor country and judged least likely to succeed. We had and we have no resources. Food, energy, water is imported. The focus in the 1960s, when we became independent, was jobs, investments, and education. The objective was to grow the opportunities for the people of Singapore with the best educational opportunities, new infrastructure, and high technology and high value-added opportunities. In the 1960s and 1970s, no one could envision the F1 taking place in Singapore. In fact, they did come to us in the 1970s and we turned them away because it was not the priority at that time. No one, in fact, at that time could envision the modern Singapore with green spaces, a bustling urban environment, and a regional hub. Singapore is now considered the New York City of Asia. In fact, there's much that we can learn and do learn from New York, and there's a great deal of exchange of ideas and perspectives about urban and environmental challenges of the future. In the growth of Singapore over the past 50 years, there have been tremendous opportunities for US companies. Singapore has always been open to foreign investments, and the US has taken the lead. The just departed US ambassador to Singapore, David Edelman, who stepped down about 2 weeks ago, in his farewell interviews, said that there are more US investments in Singapore than there are in China. Now think of that. Singapore, a population of 5 million, China, a population of 1.3 billion. Think of that comparison. Now these investments are not just focused on the 5 million Singaporean residents, but they are focused broadly in the region. Almost half of the Fortune 500 companies have their regional hubs or headquarters in Singapore. And there is a thriving ecosystem of manufacturing, financial institutions, legal and other key services, not just from the US, but from other global players, including China, India, Europe, Brazil, across the world. So it really presents this place for companies to come together, incubate ideas, and put them out into the whole Asian region. But Singapore's growth has not come just from the work that we have done. It's come on the back of a fairly successful Southeast Asian region, which is coming together as an economic community under something called ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Collectively, there are 10 countries in ASEAN, and they have a population larger than Europe and a GDP greater than India or Russia. There's, of course, a huge economic diversity in the region, with economies such as ultra-modern Singapore, right through to newly emerging Myanmar, or Burma, as some people still call it. As a group, the 10 Southeast Asian countries have posted a respectable average growth of above 5% a year. What we are trying to do in this vast, diverse region is to unlock the potential of the geography by pushing together an economic integration through something called an ASEAN Economic Community, which will come into force at the end of 2015. Now, this Southeast Asian economy that we are building together is supported by two very strong wings, China and India. If you can envision the map of the Asia-Pacific. As two very large economies, both China and India face their own challenges as they move forward with economic reforms and other priorities. But I think that there is little doubt that both China and India will continue to grow, and the ASEAN economies have hitched their future to this new dynamic in the Asia-Pacific region. There are also other important players in the Asia-Pacific region, including Japan, Korea, and Australia. ASEAN is working with all of them to build a regional comprehensive economic partnership, what we call RCEP. We like very much acronyms in Southeast Asia, so there will be acronyms as I speak through this afternoon. But the RCEP, or this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, will facilitate trade and investments in the wider Asia-Pacific region, and in terms of scale, it will constitute half the world's population and a third of its GDP. Now, there are good reasons for this confidence in Asia's economic outlook. Southeast Asia has relatively strong structural underpinnings for growth, and it will allow the region to weather the capital volatilities that some of us are seeing today. Southeast Asia went through the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 1998. And out of that, they've emerged stronger. Companies have put in place the right strategies. Countries have put in place the domestic safeguards. And we've erected regional safety nets, such as the Chiang Mai Multilateral Initiative, where countries support each other if there's a destabilizing flow of capital. In the medium term, this growth story is going to enter a new phase, driven by consumption. Already, China accounts for a quarter of the world's demand for luxury goods. In ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, personal incomes have more than doubled over the past decade. Indonesia, which is the largest country in Southeast Asia, a country of 240 million people, 60% of the households are expected to reach middle-class status by 2020. An OECD study projected that Asian middle-class consumers will constitute 60% of the global middle class by 2020, up from 20% now. What's also building on this economic outlook is the intra-ASEAN economic trade that is coming together. This has more than tripled in the past decade, and as I mentioned, the region is moving towards deeper integration. It will make it easier for companies to operate regionally and to leverage on the different competitive advantages offered by each ASEAN country. There's also the political outlook, which I have to mention briefly. Maintaining stability in the region is critical to realizing this very positive economic outlook. China has just had its once-in-a-decade leadership transition. This new leadership appears driven by the need for regional stability and economic reform, and which will push towards a more equitable and sustainable growth for itself. It is also charting a new course for its regional relationships. In Japan, after years of economic and political difficulties, Prime Minister Abe has set a clear agenda to restore confidence and revive the economy. In Southeast Asia itself, Indonesia, which has been a key player in regional stability, will go through very significant elections next year. The current president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, will step down after 10 years in office. In Myanmar, a very important country for the US engagement with Southeast Asia, they are scheduled to hold their elections in 2015, and it will be a key test of their political and economic development. But I can say with confidence, having spent the time looking at these countries, that no matter what the electoral timetable that you see in the region, the principal focus of the regional leaders is economic growth and political stability. More broadly, in terms of the political outlook, the main dynamic of regional stability will come from US-China relations. It is encouraging that leaders from both sides are committed to keeping relations on an even keel, even as they deal with economic and strategic issues like cybersecurity. Territorial disputes in the East and South China Seas are also a potential flashpoint, and it is important that all the parties involved maintain the freedom of navigation and resolve the disputes peacefully and through international law, including a UN Convention on Law of the Sea. At this point, I want to speak briefly on the US role, because the US is very much part of this dynamic in the Asia-Pacific. The region has welcomed very warmly the US's continued emphasis on Asia, and in particular on Southeast Asia. For Asia, even as they speak of the pivot here and the engagement, the US has never really left the region in the past 50 years. And despite sensitivities in some of the relationships, it is widely recognized that the US is a resident power and there remains a resilient reservoir of goodwill for the US in Southeast Asia. For many countries in Asia, the US security presence is a benign presence that has preserved peace and security and has been a precondition for the region's economic rise. And we look forward to this continuing. President Barack Obama will be spending almost 2 weeks in Southeast Asia in early October. He will attend key multilateral meetings, APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Community, and the EAS, the East Asia Summit, and will visit 4 Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines. By the end of these visits, President Obama would have visited 8 out of 10 ASEAN countries during his term in office. He became the first US president to visit Myanmar last year, and in his visit to Malaysia next month, he'll be the first US president to visit Malaysia since President Johnson did it almost 5 decades ago. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton visited all 10 ASEAN countries before stepping down. The White House has also welcomed a whole stream of Southeast Asian leaders this year. But the region and that architecture is rapidly evolving, and it's important that the US maintain and grow its equities in the region. This requires sustained policy attention and very energetic diplomacy. In particular, the US should lean in with a very robust economic strategy for the region. In Southeast Asia in particular, what we have seen is that the US economic cooperation with ASEAN has lagged behind ASEAN's other partners. Where the US was a major trade and investment partner for most countries, it is now slipping to number 3 or number 4. And it's important to try and fix that unbalance. So ASEAN, on its part, has been looking to deepen its economic links with the US. And the opportunities, as I mentioned, of Asian consumers are tremendous for the US. The trader in Bangkok tapping on an iPhone, or the public health official in Jakarta who wants better healthcare systems, everyone in the region is looking for US innovation and technology. My Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, visited Washington, D.C. earlier this year in April. And in a speech he gave over there, he said, in Asia, trade is strategy. The US will stand to gain economically and strategically if it demonstrates a strong focus on its trade strategy in the Asia Pacific. it would also then have a say in the eventual trade architecture of the region to ensure that principles such as fair competition, protection of intellectual property rights, openness, and the rule of law will benefit U.S. companies. The U.S. has become partner to something that we call the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and many of these objectives will be achieved through those TPP negotiations. The TPP, which pulls together the US, Japan, and 10 other countries, will cover almost 40% of global GDP. It's been 3 years of negotiations, and we're near almost the concluding rounds of negotiations. We hope that with this TPP, the US will be part of that economic architecture of the region, and it will benefit US companies and US consumers throughout the world. To conclude, the stakes are high for the US to sustain its Asia-Pacific focus as it looks for new growth opportunities. It should press on with its deepening economic cooperation with ASEAN, as well as conclude the TPP as soon as possible. Fundamentally, the US and Southeast Asia are natural partners. The US is a base for innovation and ideas, and Southeast Asia is a region for boundless drive and dynamism. The stage is set of how we can harness the synergy and lay the foundation for a peaceful and stable Asia-Pacific for the years to come. In this, US companies and corporations have been in the forefront, and we look forward to continuing to welcome US companies in the region for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.